Well, hey everybody, it is Romania Black, and we, if I adjust my mic here, are on episode 3 of Dororo. Oh my gosh! I'm so excited. I have really enjoyed the first 2 episodes. There's still a bit of mystery involved as to how our boy Hyakkimaru is getting all of his parts and pieces back. We've speculated, we have theories. We've gotten a little bit of Daigo last episode just to know that there's some border issues that he might be wanting to take care of. But last episode we got Bondi, which was the snake woman, the woman possessed by the snake demon, and that was an interesting episode because it was establishing that there are demons we have to defeat, but there are also these supernatural entities that are maybe not our enemy but our allies. It had a very Princess Mononoke vibe to it, I'm not gonna lie. And then also, obviously, Dororo is adorable, and him and Hyakkimaru are slowly building their rapport, building their dynamic, and we have the blind man now that is following them as well, who knows Hyakkimaru from the past, knows that he was the baby, but we have lots of mystery still left to solve, and we're only on episode 3 of 24 episodes, so lots to go. But I'm really excited. I'm obviously recording a little bit ahead, so this is before Patreon and YouTube have seen these episodes. So I'll be very curious to see your thoughts as we dive further into this. But before we start, I want to give a quick shout out over to our philanthropy tier over on Patreon. Obviously, I'm excited about anybody on YouTube or Patreon that support me, but I want to give a special shout out each week to those that donate a little bit more to the channel to help me be able to do these reactions and justify adding on all the extras and things that I do. So, with that being said, I want to give a shout out to Alex Cornejo, to Anime Annie, to Be Happy, to Bryant Reed, to Dana, to Danny Donmai, to Devorin, as well as Destiny Marie, Damage3245, Danger Zone, as well as Ichu, Eric, Fisho, Ghostly Turnip, El Freya, Lyndon, Liam Poles, Matthew Palfinier, Murphy, Nameless Monster, Nicholas, as well as Sunspots Trails, Shimayama, Translucent Men, Alexandra Q, and Maroni W. Thank you so much for your support. I greatly appreciate it. All of my love. So yeah. I'm excited to see what this episode brings us. I don't know. I do like the format where it's like the story of, and we go and focus on a central character and their relation to Dororo and Hyakkimaru. And then we see how they are related. Eventually, I'm predicting fairly early, do I think that Hyakkimaru will eventually get around to seeing his half-brother? Well, no, it's not his half-brother. It's his full brother, Taromaru. Do I think that they'll get around to seeing each other at some point in the series? Absolutely. I want the mom to be able to know that her son lived and the son that she loved is still alive. Daigo ain't gonna like it, but we'll let them deal with that. But I do think they're all gonna meet up. It's gonna be a family reunion at some point. Dororo is gonna be like, oh, but we'll cross those bridges when we get there. So we're not gonna waste any more time. We're gonna dive right in to episode 3 of Dororo, and we're gonna do that here in 3, 2, 1, and let's go. And we are 3 episodes in, and it is already coming for the jugular. I would say if you had a 3-episode rule, this would have done it. Yep. Yep. Okay. All right. Oh my gosh. Y'all just... I really like this episode, and I think that we have a 24 episode series, I am assuming. And if we're breaking this down if you were breaking it down to 3 acts, like a Western narrative structure, it would be 8 episodes per act. If you're breaking it down in terms of the Japanese structure, then it would be 6 episodes per act. So we're still pretty early on in the introductions. We're introducing all the main characters. We got a lot of introductions in terms of seeing Taromaru and his relationship with his dad, seeing Jukai and his relationship with Hyakkimaru, seeing how Dororo and the old man are empathizing with Hyakkimaru and his plight. Like, what's so fascinating about this series so far is the way that they humanize all parties to an extent, right? To an extent, all the parties are humanized. And it kind of shows the kind of absurdity of war in itself, because at the end of the day, the people battling on both sides are human And for whatever reason, I like that they don't really delve too far into the reasons why they're fighting, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. The point is that the violence begets violence, hatred begets hatred, and that cycle is really, really hard to break. And you see from this episode how both sides can have parts of them that are so human and relatable, and neither side is totally evil. Although we could talk about Sheba here and the whole army and the crucifixion of the people there, but characters like Jukai, characters like Daigo even, like, have parts of them that you're like, that's not totally evil, but then it's their actions and also the way that the show frames them side by side that's so fascinating, and I'm kind of in love with it. I love what this series is doing. It's giving me, it relates a lot to Berserk, relates a lot to Attack on Titan. There's a lot of thematic elements of this series that you can relate to both of those. Now, obviously, Dororo came before Berserk and before Attack on Titan. It was like from the 60s, if I'm correct, because this was 2019 is when this series was created. There was previously a series from like way back in the late 60s. I could have watched that one, but one, I knew it was not going to be easy to find, nor probably the quality that I wanted for reactions. And also, you know, I have nothing against 60s and 70s animation, but the technology at the time, it's like, would it have been a faithful adaptation to the series? Or now animations come so far, I feel like this would be a better adaptation. I could be wrong, though. I might have to look up the 60s adaptation after I'm done with this series and sort of compare and contrast. But we could argue Dororo came before Berserk, before Attack on Titan, but I think that's kind of in itself the point. Themes of war, they haven't changed, and that's the saddest part of all. But let's dive into this episode. From the get-go, boom, like that gong, that soundtrack was like, bam, you need to be paying attention. And I love that you have the sun, the ever-present, always there sun in the center. And I like that you have the two trees diverged around it, which you could argue symbolizes two sides. But if you notice, they're the same tree. The tree is parted in two directions, but it's the same species of tree, showing how humanity may be separated on either side of a war, but at the end of the day, they're the same being. Oh, it's so good. The symbolism's so damn good. I love it. I love it, love it, love it. So yeah, see the same trees. The war had ravaged the land for years. We don't even tell what kind of war it is because it doesn't matter at the end of the day. The soil was soaked with blood. Now they make the comment that they're rebels, but that's what the Sheba guy calls them, obviously. You know, the brutality of this opening scene, I was like, oh, I can see why this is replacing Berserk. But the thing that's so horrific, so Jukai's job was to crucify the rebels at the end of the battle. I like the transition that we've gone from Jukai working under Sheba to crucify the rebels and put them on display, to transitioning that woodworking and that tool set to fixing the bodies, to where it's like you went from doing an act that depraves their humanity, you're just putting them up on a cross, depriving them of humanity and making them a literal yard ornament to ward off people from fighting, to go from that disrespect to the dead to instead having a burial, making their bodies complete, praying over them and letting them have a moment of rest as their final journey. The contrast is so extreme, right? And honestly, you could tell Jukai didn't like the job he did. Like, the one guy begs for Jukai to kill him and he nails that in. But what's so interesting is that Jukai, you can see him hesitate to put the nail in. Like, he doesn't want to do it, but he does it because that's his job, right? And there's a lot of fault with that. There's a lot of sin with that. Like, you chose to kill these people. And granted, they were already half dead from the battle, but you chose to end their lives. And so he has all that blood on his hands. And the fact that he knows anatomy, from cutting their ears off, from cutting their fingers off. Like, there's a lot of torture that goes on in this opening scene that was hard to watch. But Jukai stomachs through it. But what ends up getting him is that the woman, she runs towards her husband and she ends up getting stabbed. And then the soldier says, hang that up there. Like, hang that. Like didn't even recognize her as a person. Just recognized her as a thing. And at that point, Jukai's like, because I'm sure that, you know, people that do acts like that, they have to justify in their head why they're doing it. And I'm sure that Jukai justified in his head, it's part of my job. It's my duty as a soldier to do this. These are rebels. It's their fault for rebelling against our people. They're the ones that signed up for battle. So if they die, it's not on me. Like, I'm sure he justified it in his head however way he could to get through it. But then the moment the woman steps in, who was not a soldier, she was innocent. She was just frantic and horrified at her husband being hung up there, that blood being spilt, you can't justify it anymore. Then it's suddenly in the forefront to him, like, shit, no, all of this is coming, it all collapses at once. And you can't say that she deserved what happened to her. So what he ends up doing is he ends up, like, in his grief, which is just insane, as he walks by all the bodies hanging there, and just walks through and then throws himself off the cliff. And then that's it. I definitely respect this. I've talked about this in Berserk at length. The story of Jukai. I've talked about this with Berserk at length, but Berserk, Miura definitely does a lot like Isayama with Attack on Titan in making the world as dour and depressing and horrific as possible. And there's definitely some hyperbole to what Miura and Isayama do at times, because one of my biggest complaints about Attack on Titan was that there were lots of moments where I was like, well, in reality, would it be as no way out as this world? And I would argue that it's not. And in Berserk, I feel it's the same way. I feel like because it's a narrative, because it's fiction, it gets to an extreme where there's no good route for a character to go on. If you're choosing your own adventure, there's no good way out. And I would argue in reality there is. So that was my complaint with those two series. Here, it gets dark, it gets dour, it gets depressing, but it never, I feel, strays too far from the reality of choice, where there are still avenues characters can take to get out of that corner. So far, we're only 3 episodes in, so I could be proven wrong later on. But right now, like with Jukai, there were avenues. He had lots of choice as a character, and that feels realistic. It feels like realistically a character can do a lot of things. And I feel like this series gives breathing room to the ambiance to let that be a thing. So Kaname, I missed. So here's my thing. When they first said Kaname at the beginning, I didn't know as the reactor, because his face kind of looks a little bit like it could be a young Jukai. I didn't know if Jukai was like a surname or Kaname was like a first name or what the case may be. I didn't know for sure in the reaction if how far back in the flashback we were going, and if this was like a young Jukai and it showed him like watching his father and picking up those skills. And then I had in my head this entire storyline where Kaname was Jukai and then the doctor dies and he picks up the skills and takes over the business and does all that. I had a whole plot line mapped out in 5 minutes of where this story was going. And then you find out that no, Kaname is just a kid, an orphan whose father died in the war that Jukai fought in on the other side. And he ends up working with Jukai after Jukai gives him the prosthetic leg. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm glad that we eventually got clarification of the timeline, because you just never know. And I would say this, the thing about it is they don't tell us how far back we go. Obviously, it's at least 16 years back, because at the end of the flashback, he finds Hyakkimaru and then it transitions to a different flashback. But at first, they don't quite tell you. And the clothing style doesn't change very much in the course of this series. There's not a lot of difference between the clothing styles. You can't really tell the timeline as much. And they established that there's been wars going on nonstop, so you can't really use that as a measurement. And so it's trying to figure out where we're at. And Jukai is one of those characters that he kind of looks the same 16 years ago as he does now, except maybe, the hair color's changed, but in the sepia, you can't quite tell. So it was a little bit more difficult to figure that out. But yeah, he's known as the guy that he helps people out, helps them amputees and people get their mobility back. And he's just there working on them nonstop. And what's interesting is he doesn't at any point in time look like he's not... Everybody's calling him like Buddha and praising him and doing all of that. But then when you actually see him in action, he's not relishing in any of that praise. He's not sitting there being like, why, thank you. Yes, I am an amazing doctor. He's not advertising himself as such. And that's because that's not the point. The point is that he's just trying to, in some way, make people's lives better. And he says it himself. He's like, I can't, even begin to say this is going to atone. But he's like, I was spared for a reason, and this is what I have to do. And so he never looks like he's relishing in the praise in these flashbacks. He looks like he's struggling every single moment to get through it. And when he gives the kid his leg back, and helps him move around with it for Kaname, he's like, the master gave me a reason to live when I was an orphan. And that's kind of the thing, is that what I love about this episode is showing the trajectory of kindness, in that it's in contrast to war and the finality of death, because on that battlefield, the options were death. On that battlefield, when Jukai was at the beginning, everyone had to die and there was no chance for life. And here you get the polar opposite, where he gave Kaname a reason to live. He gave Hyakkimaru a way to live. He himself was given the opportunity to live, so he's trying to make the most of it. And it's really beautiful to see the comparison of the two. And the episode does a really good job of making it subtle and not preachy at all. And he's like, I'm happy to be able to work here. Well, until he finds out the truth about Jukai's past. I do think it's also worth noting that when Kaname gets up and he watches Jukai is hard at work. Like, Jukai makes every single moment of his existence towards helping others, because that's the only way he feels that he can do right by his past and what he's done. So we get the woman whose son is hurt. And yeah, the color spotting of the blood, it was unexpected in the moment. It didn't stand out as much now, but yeah, the blood there and the color spot, I wonder if that's in the manga like that. That would be highly effective. But then the woman, I think it's also important to know that the woman, and the fact that she has the scar running across her face, the fact that all these people are amputated, all these people are struggling, it kind of shows the effects of war on people that are not just the soldiers. I think of Grave of the Fireflies a little bit with this episode, because in Grave of the Fireflies, you don't actually see the battles themselves. And that's something that's really nice about this series so far. We don't actually see the fighting. We just see the effects. We just see the aftermath. So what I like about this series is they don't glorify the battles. They show the horrific aftermath and the people that have to suffer through that aftermath and find ways to move on when the battle's over. That's another thing too. And I get that Attack on Titan and Berserk, that's kind of the whole genre. That's their whole thing. They have to show those battles and everything. But there are series out there that I've looked at and read that kind of glorify the battles and like, isn't this amazing and stuff? And they don't really focus on, and I'm not saying Berserk and Attack on Titan don't, because they do. But there are some series I see that it's like the battle is there, but then you don't get to really envelop yourself in the aftermath and see what the results of this battle was. And with Dororo, you do. It's actually the point. I like that they don't focus on the battles. Like, we get Hyakkimaru fighting the demons, which is great, and we see the training, and that's great, but we're not out here seeing the battles themselves because we've seen that before. Instead, it's okay, how do these people deal with the aftermath of it? And so, yeah, I also thought it was interesting that just a passing samurai picks a fight with this kid and cuts his arm off. A very brutal world that we live in Dororo. But he helps the kid to get his arm fixed up and says he's going to make him a tool. And she's like, I thought he might be a scary man based on the rumors. And that's when Kaname comes in. And the moment that Kaname comes back and is standing there in the doorway, the way that this series portrays the tension, the use of space, the element of silence, the fact that Kaname looks so disappointed and dismayed. And then you find out his dad was one of the ones that was likely crucified by Jukai. It is wild. And so he talks about how he jumped off the cliff. I feel like he doesn't go over anything we haven't already seen. He just gets us back, catches us back up to speed. And he's like, yep, I jumped to my death. I didn't die. I was brought to shore in this foreign country. Luckily, language barriers weren't a problem. And then I learned to make prosthetics for those who had lost their limbs. He's like, I knew how to work with the tools because I'd done it for my old job. And he's like, and that's how we got here. And of course, Kaname's pissed. He's like, I dare not say it's to atone for my sins. But I like that he says here, he's like, I'm not going to say I'm doing this to atone because that would be an insult. He's like, but I can't just have lived and died peacefully as if nothing happened. I didn't think it could be forgiven. And he's like, I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm not just going to sit here and do nothing. And I tried to kill myself. The fates said that wasn't the way to go. It's kind of that phrase, dying is easy, living is harder. He's like, well, if the fates deemed that I needed to live, then that's what I'm doing. And all I can do is do something and not just be at peace. And I love that he grabs the script hard while he's thinking of it. Kaname's got his fists clenched while he's thinking of it. Like, the dynamic between the two of them is crazy. I was supposed to have died, but I was made to live. It meant there was something I still had to do. And of course, you get where Jukai's coming from. He's like, I was made to live. I needed to do something, and this is all I could think of that would be to help people. What else can I do? And of course, Kaname is right to be mad because he's like, you get to live? You get to live every day, and my father died, and you were probably the one that killed him? Like, you understand why he's mad. He's like, my father was killed. And the moment that he grabs the tool and he's going to kill Jukai, and I feel like Jukai it's not that Jukai didn't want to die. I think he's like, I'll take what I get. But he's like, at this point, I got to help that kid. Let me help that kid. And then you do what you want. And what I like about Jukai is that he is a coward in a lot of ways, but he's very relatable as a coward. His cowardice is relatable. Like, humans want to live. They want to live. And so he's like, I had a moment where I threw that away and the fates threw it back to me. And he's like, I'm not going to let that go now. And it's so wild because, you get where both sides are coming from. And it's like, he's like, this is all I can do. Jukai reminded me a lot of my own grandfather. A little bit, because my grandfather fought in World War II. He was in the Navy. He was a radio man that was stationed outside of Iwo Jima. And he passed away when I was 8 years old. So I didn't get a chance to really talk to him. But my dad said that the moment he came home from World War II, he never touched a gun again. Ever. He didn't talk about it. He didn't touch a gun. After that, ever since, he became a mailman and a preacher. And that was his, I assume, and I don't know because he wasn't around to ask about, but I'm assuming in some way it was very similar to Jukai, where he's like, I know what I did and the effects of it, and I'm not going to repeat those mistakes ever again. And I'm going to try to do something to benefit someone while I'm alive and here. And so his story is so relatable. But you get where Kaname is coming for, because he's like, oh, you're begging for your life? Like, why do you get that right? And he's like, I don't care about my life. You can do whatever you want to, but I want to fix that kid's arm first. And he's like, I made a promise to that kid. I want to go through with it. And then you can kill me if you want. And so what I like about it is that Kaname and them, afterwards, Jukai thanks him. And afterwards, we get to seeing them working together in the shack. And what's so interesting is that you see them working together, but the dynamic has totally changed. They don't have that same camaraderie or dynamic at all. Like, it's like the truth coming out has changed Kaname's entire perception of Jukai, and he just can't get over it. So the kid gets his arm and thanks the doctor, and they leave. The woman's like, shit, I'm sorry I told this kid about you. Thanks for fixing my kid's arm. And then Kaname, he's like, you could never atone for what you did. And then he leaves the leg behind and leaves with his one leg. And he's like, you will never be my salvation. And I'm sure that hurt Jukai more than anything. The fact that his good deed was rejected. And Kaname has that right. Kaname has that right to say, I get where Kaname is coming from, because he's like, I can't in good faith take something made from me from the man that killed my father. He's like, I can't do it. And I did classes in grad school that was about conflict resolution. And so part of my training was like being a mediator and dealing with people that have had tense relationships like this. And one of the things that we were taught was you can't ask people to forgive. There are too many complexities, too much within their experience and their handling of it. You cannot expect someone to forgive. You can't force them to forgive. You can only let them figure that out on their own time. If they choose to forgive the person that has trespassed against them, that is their choice. But it is also their choice to say, no, I'm not going to forgive you. But the point of creating a human relationship is even if you can't forgive that person, you still have to move forward and you have to do something. So if you can't forgive them, then what do you do? And so that's kind of the route that Kaname's at. Kaname's like, I can't forgive you for killing my father, even if you saved me. He's like, I can't do it. He's like, I can't get around that. And Kaname is very free to do that. That is his right as the son to say, I can't. But what you have to do in that sense then is if you're not going to kill Jukai and you're not going to forgive him, you can't stay there because that relationship it's ruined. So him giving the leg back being like, I'm not going to let you be my salvation. I can't do that in good faith. And then hobbling away being like, I'll just take care of it myself. And poor Jukai, he understands, and him like sitting there crying over the prosthetic. Oh, it's brutal. It's brutal. And his little shoulders shaking in the animation. How dare you, Mappa? How dare you? So then he trips, as fate would have it. The little statue that he walks by, it's almost like a talisman, almost like a totem that he walks by and he's sad. And it almost feels, so at this point, I am curious if we'll ever see Kaname again. We may not, but it would be curious if we ever saw him again because Kaname, he was probably like 14 or so, or 13 or 14 when this happened, maybe 15. So he'd been in his 30s by the time we see him again. We might see Kaname again. I don't know. Or he might be just a one-off character that's like off there. But I like the idea that one door closes, another door opens. So that's when he comes across the baby of Hyakkimaru. Is it weird that there's something insanely cute about him? He's this little fetus, this little tiny infant, this baby swaddled that's like just muscle and blood and tissue. But when he like pulls down his like little mouth, is like, and he's sitting there like, he's like sucking on his finger as a baby. I'm sorry. He just wants to live. And Jukai's like, and the thing about it is, if anybody else but Jukai saw that baby like that, they probably would have screamed and ran away or tossed him in the river or whatnot. But because Jukai has seen the worst of humanity, the corpses, and he's cut people's ears off and everything, this didn't bother him. He was just like, shit, this baby's still alive. And yeah, that thing is so insanely cute. I can't, y'all. And then he's sitting there like, you wish to live. And him about to cry being like, that's the human condition. Like Jukai's like, you're not giving up. I feel Jukai feels bad sometimes because he had gave up. He had willingly been ready to toss his life away. And then he sees people like Kaname and the kid and Hyakkimaru that want to live. And I think he feels bad because he's like, I almost threw away that opportunity that you all are desperate to have. And it's like, oh. And so, yeah, he agrees to take him in. And then, so we have a year later. So Tarumaru and Hyakkimaru are a year apart in age. They're 16 and 17. Or they're 15 and 16. Okay. Of course, Daigo's like, isn't born? And they're like, you got a baby boy. He's like, thank God it's not a girl. And then he's just like, oh, this ugly baby with the bad receding hairline is mine. But he's got all his ears and everything. And he's like, this kid's going to be my heir. And she's like, thank God we don't have to go through this again. But the one thing that gets me is that regardless, she keeps looking back at that. She keeps looking back at that headless totem. That I wonder if that relates to the headless horses in the OP. We'll see where that goes. But she keeps looking back being like, of course. And here's the thing. Of course she would think about her son. He was like within hours of being born, drug away from her. Daigo does exhibit some human quality in this episode, which is why I said that at the beginning of the episode. He's not an outright evil monster entirely. He does seem to love Tarumaru. He does seem like he cares for his son. He's not one of those dad figures in anime that completely is just like, you're going to be my heir, and he like looks on from the shadows and like tosses Tarumaru off to everyone else, but just wanted an heir and nothing more. He does seem to have a role in Tarumaru's upbringing. And he does seem to like play a part. He's like Vernon Dursley, you know. He does seem to have a part in his son's upbringing, and he doesn't seem to completely ignore his son, which is great. It's just he ignores the fact that there was another son. And also ignores the fact that his wife is desperately still clinging to, because why wouldn't she be? That's her child. She gave birth to him. She seemed like she struggled a lot giving birth to him. This one, she seemed to pop him right out and everything is fine. So of course, right? Meanwhile, 6 years later, we have one's 5, one's 6. And so we have Hyakkimaru like learning to like swing through the trees. He's like relying on instinct. He's like moving around just based on what he sees and everything. And every part of him is like basically created by Jukai. And Jukai walks around. The only thing is his hair. He does naturally grow his hair out, which is cool. I like that he naturally had some hair there. And Jukai is like, I like that Hyakkimaru can recognize the presence of him. Here's the thing. I know I said this last episode that I'm going to be kind of sad when he does get his sight back, because that's going to put him, I think, at a disadvantage. But on the other hand, I want him to be able to see Jukai and to see Dororo. I want him to be able to see them and see what they look like, to see the face of the man that basically raised him. And so they get there and he gives them all these body parts so that they can move. And he's like, he can't seem to hear me or see me or speak, but he has this power to survive. And even like the eyes are fake and everything. He's literally like Pinocchio. He's like this living doll. And you guys out there got his shirt down while he's tending the fields, right? And he looks over as he's like carving out his limbs and everything, he looks over to Hyakkimaru, who's just laying there, you know, staring up at nothing, which how he sleeps and everything is just like he planks as he sleeps. But how else is he supposed to? And he teaches him his name, Hyakkimaru. And what does he say there to them? He says, this is your name. And he says on there, he's like, there are things in this world more terrifying than 100 demons. But he's like, don't succumb to them. Which is, you know, I like he has that little smile there with the mask and everything. He's like, don't succumb to the demons. Which is funny because he ends up starting to kill all of them and gaining his limbs back, right? He's like, you will overcome them. Mm-hmm. And then this one like fox demon comes after him as he has the flower, which this thing, it needed a pedicure. It had like these talons and everything. So I like the idea that we've established that there are demons in this world. Not all of them are the ones that have taken away Hyakkimaru's like limbs and senses and things like that. Some of them are just monsters, and that just happens in this world. And the people are like, oh, there's a monster. Who knew? But the 12 that are in the temple just happen to be the ones that took away his limbs. So not every monster we may fight will give Hyakkimaru part of his body back, but I'm pretty sure they're all coming for him. So that is likely to happen. And then he's like, are you okay? So Jukai gives himself a very hard time because he trained Hyakkimaru to fight back against the monsters that were coming out of him because of his power. And he gives himself a hard time about it because he says, all I've done is taught this boy to kill. And I do think he gives himself too hard of a time in a sense because, yeah, he did teach him the way of the sword. But Jukai had a lot of barriers against him. Hyakkimaru can't see, he can't speak, he can't hear. So he's like, I gotta try to teach you a way to defend yourself, but I can't talk to you about it. And then he feels bad about it. What's fascinating is the contrast between Jukai and Daigo, because Jukai sits there as a parental figure, just like, am I doing everything wrong? Did I mess up again? Have I only taught this kid how to kill? What am I going to do? Why is everything like this? Oh my God. Like, he's sitting there fretting and worrying that everything he's done has been a disservice to Hyakkimaru. Meanwhile, Daigo is out there letting others train his son, and he's just like, this is the way it's meant to be. You're my heir, and you're going to need to know. Daigo wants Taramaru to be able to kill and to know how to fight and to have this sense of pride. Jukai is very hesitant about it, but knows that Hyakkimaru can't survive without those skills. So it's like two parental figures coming at their sons with very different parenting philosophies, and it's fascinating. But he's like, in order for you to survive on your own, you have to know how to fight. And then, you compare that with Daigo, who is like, he's not teaching Taramaru to fight to survive. Taramaru is pretty spoiled. He lives in a big noble house with like everything he could want, anything he could want at any given time, but he's teaching him to fight because that's his legacy. So it's a totally different experience, right? And it's a totally different reason. And he's like, you must be strong. So yeah, you have Jukai saying you have to be strong or they will kill you. You will not live in this world. Meanwhile, Taramaru is learning to be strong because that's his duty as the heir, right? I do like Taramaru. I think he's a cute kid. He has the unfortunate features of his father, but also I think that it's interesting about their upbringing. Everyone around Taramaru praises him for how strong he is because he's the heir. He's the boss's son. We got to praise him or we'll get in trouble. And he is kind of spoiled. He doesn't act spoiled too much. I mean, he does what any 5-year-old would or 6-year-old would. But Daigo really encourages it. Whereas Jukai is like, you have to be strong or this giant fox demon's going to kill you. So yeah, and it is kind of cute where he holds a little sword up in the air and Taramaru is like, I'm the strongest in the land. And that's when he sees his dad. And see, he's like, sword practice. And here's the thing. I do feel like Daigo does a few things right. Like, he holds his son up in the air, and he seems happy to see him. I was thinking of in Berserk, very early on in the series, there's a father-son that's kind of like the father is the noble in charge, and the son is like his heir to the throne. Their relationship is really sad because the dad puts so much pressure on his son that he doesn't come across as a loving father, even though by the end of their interaction, you get that he is, but he's, under pressure himself and it projects onto the son and whatever. Here, Daigo at least seems like he's projecting like a doting, loving father. So good for him. It could be a lot worse. But then you have Taramaru that looks over his mom and he's like, oh, hey, mom. And she's like, oh, hey, kid that I was forced to have. And so then he looks over and still sees the shrine. And he feels kind of upset about it. And of course, Daigo's like, what's wrong? And he's like, it's nothing. So I get why I do feel a little bit for Taramaru because there is a little bit of a vibe with him that like he wasn't wanted by the mom. And don't get me wrong. I think she loves him. She's his kid. She's her child. But I think he feels like he's like, she likes this other kid that's not even here. And I'm right here. Like, love me too. And I get those vibes. But I'm also like, your dad's kind of a dick and made her throw away her first child. So that's why she's having issues about it. You should know. Also, you're only here because the first child didn't turn out the right way. So it definitely, Taramaru has like younger sibling syndrome. And he's like, what is it? And he's like, no, it's fine. And he's like, tell me about your last war father. He immediately changes the subject and moves on. And he's like, oh, all right. So yeah, Taramaru's got some insecurity issues that are buried down in there. Daigo's like, let me tell you about the war. And they talk about the war like it's like this big grandiose thing. Whereas meanwhile, Jukai's like, people died. And so it's again, Jukai and Daigo, totally different views about war, totally different ways of raising their son, totally different like senses of either guilt or not guilt. It's fascinating to watch how these two father figures handle raising their two sons. I love it. So yeah, the two train. Hyakkimaru gets stronger. His hair grows out. He has his fake legs. He still has one fake leg, and he's able to like defend himself. But Jukai sees him come back with all his wounds and makes note that he has no sense of pain. he like looks at the stick and everything and how bloody it is. He feels no pain, therefore he knows no fear. And I think in that point, he translates it to his own experience. He says he has no hesitation towards slashing and killing. So he feels that he understands, because for Jukai in the war, he translates no feeling of pain, no hesitation, slashing and killing as a bad thing, because that means there's no empathy. And he worries that he's raised Hyakkimaru without a sense of empathy, that he's just going to hack and kill at somebody without knowing any difference, and it's going to make him a monster. And that's why he's like, did I make a mistake? What have I done? And I think the thing about it is that one, Jukai can't help that because Hyakkimaru can't hear, but also Hyakkimaru, he doesn't realize that his son, quote unquote, can see the difference between demons and humans. He can see things that humans cannot. And that's one thing I'm afraid of, is that when he gets that sense of sight back, is he going to still be able to tell the difference between humans and monsters? That's going to be the question, right? Meanwhile, Daigo is not teaching Tarumaru the difference between human and monsters. He's just like, well, if you're strong and can win, that's all that matters. And Jukai seems to be taking a lot more thought into it. And then you see him out there like literally burying the monsters that Hyakkimaru killed, which is saying something when he buried the monsters themselves. So yeah, he kills the one demon that was one of the ones that took his ability, and he gains his leg back. And I like that it's just like, oh, no big deal. Just gained a leg back. No worries. It'll grow the skin back eventually. Don't you worry about it. And then we see the one statue of the ghoul that's been cut in two. And he's like, ghouls sometimes don't just eat people. They delude humans and lend them their powers. So he's like, they let a person benefit from their supernatural abilities. I love that as he's saying this, as he's putting the swords in his arms, but in return, they take something away. So he's like, someone made an agreement and sacrificed Hyakkimaru's body instead. And of course, Jukai's like, well, someone else made this agreement because you were a baby. So whoever that person is. I like that they basically talk about him and the old man say whoever made this agreement will surely burn in hell. So it's like Daigo's pretty much done for. And then Jukai's like, I can't go with you. I'll just be in your way. And then what's interesting is that like the way that Daigo talks, he makes himself sound like this big political figure that's like really well known. But Jukai didn't know who he was. He didn't know what the symbol meant. So it's not the Shiba clan. It's someone different. He's like, this might help you find your real parents one day. Yeah, that little pouch with that symbol, the moment Daigo sees that, he's going to freak out. The moment Tarumaru sees that, he's going to freak out. The moment that the mom sees it, she's going to freak out. Like, it is a powder keg. That little tiny emblem is a powder keg waiting to explode. But the moment that Hyakkimaru, like, reached his hand up to Jukai's face to touch it, like, to hold it, shut up. Stop. That part was so good. And then him giving them the hug at the end. So damn good. And then he goes on his way. And then that's when we go back to the present, and Dororo's like, so if he keeps killing these monsters, he could get his body back. And the old man's like, well, that seems possible. Somebody made a deal a long time ago in return for the boy's body. I like Dororo's like, how dare they? Like, what senseless beings they are. They gave it all away. And then the old man's like, one must be prepared to go to hell to do such a thing. Well, we'll see how prepared Daigo is later on, won't we? A single eye. And that's when Dororo's like, well, why would the demons take that? Like, one eyeball or one sense of pain wouldn't be enough to make a difference. And the old man's like, well, maybe it's just a way to fulfill their soul, and maybe it's just trolling. Who knows? But yeah, then Hyakkimaru puts his feet in the fire to sense pain. And Dororo was like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that, you dummy? I like that the old man kind of smiles in that moment, because he's like, I'm sure the old man knows, he's like, when you've lost something, then it's different than when you never had it. So he's like, you know, he had his sight and he lost it, but he knew from having that sight, you know, different things about the way things look and all. And Hyakkimaru has never had a sense of pain, so this is all new to him. So I'm sure the old man, it's like sensing someone like blossom, right? Even if he can't see it. But interesting. Meanwhile, we go back to Jukai, and Jukai's on the battlefield. After 16 years, we're still on the battlefield, and he's still praying over the bodies. Praying over the prosthetics he puts on the corpses. Now, in that moment, we go back over the body, and there was a leg that he put on there. That's not supposed to be Kaname, is it? Surely not. Surely it's someone... I didn't know if this was supposed to be Kaname in this moment that was a soldier that died, or if it was supposed to be just indicative and to relate back to Kaname who had lost his leg. Surely not. But he's like, I cannot go anywhere. Hyakkimaru. That part was crazy where he's like, I'm stuck here. It's like, this is my purgatory. This is my purgatory. This is where I'm at. Oh, okay. So we do get a little demon at the end. There's a little sketch of the Weasley fox demon with the giant velociraptor claws. And it says, Kamai Tachi. Interesting. This is such a good episode. There's so much to talk about it. And I really want to hear y'all's comments down below to see what you all think about it as well. But... oh, Dororo's giving us some good food. I'll say that. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts down below, but I hope y'all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and yeah, I'll be back real soon with more of Dororo.